If I'm the shame of this family, why is the most powerful man in this contract waiting for my signature? You don't understand what's at stake here. I understand perfectly. Without me, there is no contract. This is an outrage. Calm down. We will sort this out. The main hall of the Lim family's good-class bungalow in Nassim Road gleamed as if every crystal in the chandeliers had been lit to hide a crack in the facade. Waitstaff circulated with delicate flutes of champagne. Business magnates smiled for photographers. Elegant women discussed charity donations, and outside, a line of black Mercedes sedans waited in silent deference. Serafina Chen crossed the scene with one hand on her 4-month pregnant belly, wearing a simple blue dress far too understated for the tastes of this family. She didn't want to draw attention, she never had. But in this house, even her attempt to disappear was treated as an offense. Eleanor Lim saw her daughter-in-law approach and held her smile for the Tatler Singapore camera, but her eyes darkened. "You should have used the service entrance, Serafina," she said in a low, sharp tone. Julian, standing beside his mother, tightened his grip on his champagne flute. Marcus, the older brother, laughed. Maybe she wants to be in the photo to guarantee a better divorce settlement later. Serafina took a slow breath. "I didn't come here to ask for anything." Eleanor tilted her head. "That's exactly what you're doing, simply by being here, asking this family to accept the shame you carry." Julian stepped forward, too late to stop the words from hitting Serafina. "Ma, that's enough," he murmured, as if he feared the scene more than the cruelty. Eleanor turned to her son with cutting composure. "Tonight, the Lim Group is hosting Mr. Tan Wei, the man who can secure our expansion into the region, and you bring your pregnant wife here to fuel gossip." Serafina felt the baby stir faintly, or perhaps it was just her own body reacting to the blow. "You speak as if my child is a scandal," she said. Marcus adjusted his expensive Patek Philippe. "A scandal is a woman with no family background to speak of marrying into a family like ours and getting pregnant before any prenuptial agreements are finalized." Julian shot his brother a hard look. "Marcus." But it was just a name, lacking the force to protect anyone. Serafina didn't look at her husband. If she did, her eyes might have pleaded for a defense he still didn't know how to offer. Eleanor then touched her elbow with false gentleness. "Come with me. We need to talk, away from our guests." The soft jazz continued in the main hall, but the small study Eleanor led Serafina to felt like another world, cold and without witnesses. Gilded portraits of Lim ancestors covered the walls, all of them seemingly judging anyone who breathed outside of tradition. Julian followed them in, with Marcus and their cousin, Isabel, who always echoed the matriarch's cruelties in a sweet voice, trailing behind. On the polished mahogany table lay a burgundy leather folder. Serafina recognized the gesture even before she saw the paper. "Sign it," Eleanor ordered. "It's a non-disclosure agreement. You commit to not speaking with the press, not attending tomorrow's board meeting, and not approaching Mr. Tan's representatives." Serafina looked at the folder, then at Julian. "Did you know about this?" He hesitated for half a second, and that half second hurt more than his mother's command. "I knew my mother wanted to avoid any exposure," he answered. Serafina felt her throat tighten. "Avoid exposure or hide me?" Marcus opened the folder impatiently. "Both, if it helps the company." The document was filled with elegant phrasing for a humiliating intent. Serafina read it in silence, each line confirming that this family didn't just want to silence her, they wanted to reduce her to an administrative error. Eleanor sat down and crossed her legs. "You must understand your position. Julian is the face of the Lim Group. There are banks, investors, and board members depending on this contract. We cannot allow a girl who appeared from nowhere, no family name, no visible assets, and pregnant at such an inconvenient time to jeopardize everything." Serafina raised her eyes. "My child is an inconvenience to you." Isabel sighed, feigning pity. "Don't twist her words. No one is attacking the baby. We're just saying the situation is delicate." "Delicate," Serafina repeated with a joyless smile. "Is that what you call it when you want to erase someone without sounding cruel?" Julian took a step forward. "Serafina, please, let's talk about this at home." She finally looked at him. "This is supposed to be my home too, Julian, but you've just handed me a document to prove it never was." Before Julian could reply, Serafina's phone vibrated inside her small handbag. A name lit up the screen for an instant: David Ho. She quickly closed her bag, but Eleanor noticed. The matriarch's eyes narrowed, not with curiosity, but with a flicker of uneasy recognition. "Who is David Ho?" she asked. Serafina held the bag against her body. "My lawyer." Marcus let out a dry laugh. "A lawyer? What for?" Are you going to sue the family for a lack of affection? Serafina remained unshaken. To ensure no one makes me sign something I don't understand. Eleanor rose slowly. Be careful with your tone. In this house, no one threatens the limbs. Serafina touched the silver ring on a thin chain around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. It was a small gesture, but Eleanor saw it. For a second, her face lost all color. Julian noticed the brief flash of fear cross his mother's expression. Ma? Eleanor recomposed herself. Sign it, Serafina, and go home before the photographers see too much of you. Serafina stood motionless before the table, the memory of her mother emerging like an old photograph. Grace Chen had worn that same ring the last time she took her daughter to a law office, saying that some documents were like buried seeds. They seemed dead until the right season arrived. Serafina hadn't understood then. She understood later, growing up watching her mother fall ill from a sickness of silence, refusing to speak ill of the limbs even when their name appeared in the business times as a symbol of power. Promise me you won't use this out of hatred, Grace had said. Use it only when they try to take away your very right to exist. Serafina had promised. That was why she had accepted the marriage to Julian without revealing everything. It was why she had stayed silent when Eleanor called her a gold digger. It was why she had waited. But in that study, with her hand on her womb and a document of erasure before her, Serafina realized the promise didn't demand submission. It demanded measure. It demanded dignity. I'm not signing it, she said, her voice firmer than Julian had ever heard it. Marcus slammed the folder shut. You think you have a choice? Serafina held his gaze. Everyone has one. The problem is, you've grown accustomed to buying other people's choices. Julian touched his wife's arm, but she gently moved away. That small retreat wounded him more than an accusation. Serafina, I don't want you to be hurt by the media, he said. She answered quietly, but every word landed cleanly. Then don't let your family feed me to the media as the guilty party before anyone has even asked my name. Eleanor tapped her fingers on the table. Your name doesn't matter here. What matters is the limb name. Serafina took a deep breath. That's funny. It's not always the most famous name that keeps a company afloat. The silence was swift. Julian frowned. Eleanor, however, understood enough to become even colder. A staff member knocked on the door and announced that Mr. Tan's party had arrived. The news shot through the room like an electric current. Eleanor put on her matriarchal smile before she even left the room. Marcus straightened his suit jacket. Julian looked at Serafina, torn between staying with her and rushing to the deal that could save months of negotiations. Stay here for a few minutes, he pleaded. I'll come back. Serafina almost laughed, but there was no humor left. You always come back later, Julian. After your mother has spoken, after your brother has decided, after I've swallowed it all. He looked as if he'd been silently struck. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. She moved past him and opened the door before anyone could stop. In the corridor, the music swelled again. The guests had no idea that, just a few meters away, an entire family had just tried to hide a pregnant woman as if she were a flaw in a contract. In the main hall, the arrival of Tan Wei changed the atmosphere. He was a man with graying hair, a discreet posture, and an air of effortless authority. Eleanor approached him with calculated elegance. Wei, what an honor to welcome you to our home. He greeted her politely, then Julian, then Marcus, but his eyes scanned the room, as if searching for someone else. Serafina was near the veranda, partially hidden by an arrangement of white orchids. When Mr. Tan saw her, his expression shifted. It wasn't theatrical surprise. It was a deep, almost pained recognition. Eleanor noticed and hardened. That's just Serafina, Julian's wife. She isn't involved in the group's affairs. Mr. Tan looked at the matriarch with cool politeness. Just Serafina? The question was quiet, but a few nearby guests heard it. He then walked towards Serafina. Mrs. Lim, I tried to speak with your lawyer. Mr. Ho informed me that you would be deciding personally whether tomorrow's meeting will proceed. The hall seemed to fall silent. Eleanor was still smiling. There must be some mistake. Serafina is tired and doesn't understand these negotiations. Mr. Tan replied without raising his voice. With all due respect, Eleanor, if there is anyone in this room who understands the weight of this contract, it is her. Julian stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. Serafina, what is he talking about? She looked at him and saw fear, not arrogance. Beatrice tried to laugh, but the sound came out thin. This is absurd. Serafina has no connection to Tan Holdings. No, Mr. Tan said, his gaze unwavering. Not directly, but she has a connection to the Grace Foundation. Upon hearing that name, Eleanor lost her composure completely. Marcus asked brusquely, "What foundation?" Serafina closed her hand over the chain of her ring, feeling her mother's presence like a steadying breath beside her. She could have turned the charity dinner into a tribunal, but she chose something else. "Not today," she told Mr. Tan. "Today, I only came to remind everyone that a person doesn't lose their dignity just because a powerful family decides to call her their shame." Eleanor whispered, almost through gritted teeth, "You don't know who you're playing with." Serafina turned to her. "If I'm the shame of this family, why is the most powerful man in this contract waiting for my signature?" No one answered. For the first time since Serafina had entered that mansion, the silence didn't crush her. It sided with her. Marcus tried to regain control, saying the conversation should continue in private, but Mr. Tan interrupted him with devastating calm. "From now on, any conversation about the Lim Group's expansion that excludes Mrs. Lim will be considered incomplete." Eleanor turned pale. Serafina felt her phone vibrate again. "This time," she answered. On the other end, David Ho spoke, with contained urgency. "Serafina, the registry records have been released. The transfer of voting rights is complete. At the board meeting tomorrow, no one will be able to ignore you." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, Julian was standing before her, without an answer, without a defense, without an excuse, capable of erasing what he had allowed to happen. Serafina put her phone away and said simply, "Tomorrow, you'll all understand why my mother was never afraid of the Lim family name." The next morning, Singapore awoke to a low, gray sky over Marina Bay, as if the entire city were holding a tension that didn't yet have a name. Serafina hadn't slept. She had sat by the window of her flat, watching the headlights crawl between glass towers, her hand resting on her belly with a calm she didn't feel. Julian appeared at the living room door just before 7 a.m., still in the wrinkled shirt from the night before, his face that of a man who had rehearsed many lines without choosing one. "Were you going to tell me?" he asked, not with aggression, but with a pain that tried to pass for control. Serafina didn't turn immediately. "Tell you what, Julian, that I existed before I became your wife?" He closed his eyes. "You know that's not what I mean." She finally looked at him. "I know. Yesterday, your family asked me to disappear from a meeting that depends on my signature, and you're still asking why I didn't tell you." Julian took 2 steps, but stopped when he realized that any approach without truth would be just another invasion. "I didn't know about the Grace Foundation." "But you knew about the folder," Serafina replied with contained bitterness. "You knew your mother wanted to silence me, and you still called it avoiding exposure." Julian found no defense. For the first time, the word protection felt dirty in his own hands. He had grown up hearing that the Lim name had to be preserved at all costs, that scandals killed companies, and that feelings were private matters in the face of contracts. Serafina had always been the point where those beliefs failed. "I was wrong," he said quietly. Serafina held his gaze for a few seconds. "It's not enough to know that yet." Before Julian could respond, the intercom buzzed. The security guard announced a courier from Ho and Partners. Serafina authorized his entry and signed for a sealed manila envelope stamped by a notary public. "Is that for the meeting today?" he asked. She held the envelope to her chest. "It's to stop your family from turning my dignity into a contract clause." At the Lim Group's corporate headquarters in Marina Bay Financial Center, Eleanor was already commanding the morning, as if the previous night hadn't fractured anything. She wore a pale Chanel suit, discreet pearls, and a serenity that intimidated secretaries, directors, and even her own eldest son. Marcus paced beside her, phone pressed to his ear, giving instructions to a PR consultant. "Don't use the word crisis," he said. "Use family instability. Say Julian is protecting the company from emotional interference." Eleanor stopped in front of the glass door of the legal department. "And Serafina?" Marcus smiled. "The press has already received the briefing. Pregnant wife, emotionally fragile, attempting to interfere in husband's corporate decisions. Nothing too accusatory, just enough to make her look inconvenient." Eleanor nodded but didn't smile. The name Grace Foundation still echoed in her mind like a long-shut drawer being forced open. "Prepare an addendum to the prenuptial agreement," she ordered. "If Serafina shows up here, she signs it before she sets foot in the boardroom." In the legal department, 2 in-house lawyers waited with tense expressions. On the table lay the new addendum, drafted overnight. The document stated that Serafina waived any indirect participation in the Lim Group's negotiations and acknowledged she had no economic interest in the family's decisions. It looked technical, it looked clean, but it was a trap. One of the lawyers, Mr. Peixoto, cleared his throat before speaking. "Mrs. Lim, there's a problem." She raised an eyebrow. "Problems are for solving, Mr. Peichoto." He pointed to a copy of the original marriage contract. "There is a wealth protection clause that prevents any waiver signed under familial pressure or during a period of medical vulnerability, and it makes express mention of assets predating the marriage." Marcus frowned. "That's standard." The lawyer hesitated. "Not to this degree. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they wanted to protect." Eleanor snatched the paper from his hand. Seeing the letterhead of Ho and Partners at the bottom, she felt an old anger rise in her chest. Grace had prepared this even before she died. Meanwhile, Serafina arrived at David Ho's office on a high floor of a Raffles Place tower. The lawyer was a man with a calm voice and almost white hair, an old friend of her mother's. He received Serafina with a blue folder on his desk. "Your mother knew this day might come," he said. Serafina touched the cover gently. "She also knew I would hate this day." David took a deep breath. "Grace didn't want revenge. She wanted you to have a choice." Serafina looked out the window. "Yesterday, they called me a shame in front of my husband." The lawyer lowered his voice. "And today, they will try to call you unstable, a gold digger. They might even insinuate something about the baby's paternity." Serafina clenched her fist. "They don't have that right." "No, not a right," David said, opening another envelope. "A strategy. That's why we need to get to the boardroom before their narrative does." Julian entered the MBFC building around 10 a.m. and immediately sensed something was wrong. Employees who used to greet him casually now averted their eyes. On the screen of a phone left on a counter, he saw the headline of a business news portal, "Family Crisis Threatens $1 billion Lim Group Deal." The chosen photo showed Serafina on the veranda of the mansion, one hand on her belly, her face serious. The caption implied that Julian Lim's young wife was pressuring the family amidst a pregnancy surrounded by questions. Julian felt his blood run cold. He walked into his mother's office without knocking. "You authorized this?" Eleanor, seated behind her desk, didn't feign surprise. "I authorized damage control." He threw his phone on the desk. "This is destroying my wife. Your wife is destroying what your grandfather built." Julian looked at her as if that sentence had opened a door to something too ugly to ignore. "Don't talk about her as if she's an intruder." Eleanor stood up, her eyes hard. "Then make your wife stop acting like one." Marcus entered shortly after, carrying the addendum in a black folder. "Julian, the situation is simple. Serafina signs, steps away from the meeting, and you two sort out your marriage at home." Julian turned slowly. "What marriage is left when my family treats my wife like a threat?" Marcus's smile vanished. "The kind of marriage that doesn't sink a company." Eleanor seized the silence to strike at the cruelest point. "Are you sure you know everything about her? About this foundation? About this lawyer? About this pregnancy?" Julian turned pale. "Don't do this." His mother moved closer. "I'm asking the question the board will ask if she walks into that room. Who is Serafina Chen? Why did she hide assets? What certainty do you have about a child conceived in the midst of so many secrets?" Julian stared at his mother with repulsion. "If you touch my son with that lie, I will not forgive you." Eleanor realized that something in him was finally changing. Julian opened the folder, read the first few lines, and held up the document. "Who ordered this to be written, knowing she's pregnant and being targeted by the press?" "I did," Eleanor replied without blinking. Serafina arrived at the building just before noon. She didn't use the service lift as Eleanor had suggested the night before, nor the side entrance reserved for staff. She walked through the main reception with David Ho by her side and the blue folder in her hands. She wore a simple beige dress, her hair tied back, with discreet makeup, and yet everyone looked at her as if a news story had just taken human form. Some whispered, others pretended to check their phones. Serafina heard the word pregnancy. She heard gold digger. She heard questions. Each syllable tried to land where it hurt, but she walked without quickening her pace. In the private elevator, David asked if she wanted a few minutes. Serafina looked at her own reflection. "I've spent months giving other people minutes to respect me. Today, all I need is an open door." When the doors opened on the executive floor, Julian was waiting. "I saw the article, Serafina. I didn't authorize it," she replied without aggression. "But your family felt authorized by your years of silence." Julian accepted the sentence like a debt. "You're right." Serafina seemed surprised but didn't soften. "Don't say that because you're afraid of losing me." He took a deep breath. "I'm afraid because I've already started to lose you." David took a discreet step back. Julian spoke more quietly. "My mother tried to insinuate things. About the baby. Serafina closed her eyes for a moment. And you? He swallowed hard. I told her I wouldn't allow it. After she said it. The sentence was simple, but it hit the right spot. Julian nodded. After. As always. Serafina looked away. I don't need you to destroy your family for me. I need you to stop asking me to survive silently within it. Before he could answer, Marcus appeared in the corridor with 2 corporate security guards and an expression of hurried triumph. Serafina Chen, the board meeting is restricted. David Ho calmly opened the blue folder. Mrs. Lim isn't here as the wife of Julian Lim. She is here as the legal representative of shareholding interests recognized by law. Marcus reached for the document, but David didn't hand it over. The board will receive their copies in the meeting room. Eleanor emerged from behind her son, perfect in her iciness. Serafina, you can still avoid a greater humiliation. Sign the addendum, excuse yourself for health reasons, and no one needs to know any unpleasant details. Serafina looked at her mother-in-law. Details like my mother's name? Eleanor didn't move, but her fingers clenched. Don't use the dead to win arguments. Serafina felt her throat tighten, but her voice remained steady. You're the one who has spent years using the silence of the dead to maintain your power. Julian turned to his mother. What happened between you and Grace Chen? Nothing that concerns you, Eleanor replied without looking at him. Serafina then understood that this was the first real crack. The matriarch still had power, but she no longer controlled all the questions. The boardroom door opened, revealing seated directors, impatient board members, and a screen where the Lim Group logo shared space with that of Tan Holdings. Mr. Tan had not yet arrived. His absence made everyone more nervous. Eleanor tried to walk past Serafina, but her daughter-in-law didn't move. You called me a shame, Serafina said in a low voice. I didn't come here today to prove I'm better than you. I came to prove I am not the property of your narrative. Eleanor brought her face close. Do you think documents can buy respect? No, Serafina answered. But they stop people like you from turning lies into official truth. Julian heard every word without interfering. He understood, late and painfully, that protecting Serafina now didn't mean speaking for her. It meant not interrupting when she finally spoke for herself. Before they could enter, Eleanor's phone vibrated. She looked at the message and paled slightly. Marcus noticed. What is it? She didn't answer. The message was from a journalist well known to the family. We've received information about Grace Chen and an old restructuring of the Lim Group. Would you like to comment before we publish? Eleanor blanked the screen, but Julian saw enough. Serafina did too. David Ho adjusted his glasses and said with calm precision, It seems we aren't the only ones who kept documents. The matriarch stared at Serafina with contained hatred. Did you leak this? Serafina shook her head. No, that's the problem with secrets, Eleanor. When too many people have been hurt to protect them, they learn to find their own way out. Inside the room, someone called for everyone to take their seats. Serafina took a deep breath and discreetly touched the silver ring. On the other side of that door wasn't just a meeting, it was the first time the Lims would have to listen to her without being able to order her out. The boardroom of the Lim Group was on the top floor of the glass tower at MBFC, surrounded by tall windows that showed an restless Singapore, the distant sound of horns, helicopters slicing through the sky, and people far too small below to imagine that up here, the entire family names could be saved or destroyed by a single signature. Serafina entered without lowering her eyes. She felt the weight of the chairs occupied by board members, legal counsel, bank representatives, and members of the Lim family who had been hastily summoned. Julian entered right behind her, not as a shield, but as someone who finally understood that standing beside her didn't mean speaking before her. Eleanor took the head of the table with the authority of someone who had commanded it for decades, while Marcus distributed cold smiles. Before we begin, he said, looking directly at Serafina, we need to register that Mrs. Lim's presence in this room has not yet been approved by the board. David Ho placed the blue folder on the table. Then please also register that any decision made without considering the rights she represents may be legally challenged. A murmur went through the room. Serafina realized that, for the first time, her mere presence was forcing this family to change its tone. Eleanor steepled her fingers elegantly. No one here wishes to disrespect legitimate rights, Mr. Ho. But so far, all we have heard are insinuations. A pregnant wife, emotionally embroiled in family conflicts, suddenly appears as a key player in a billion-dollar negotiation. The board has a duty to protect the company. Serafina felt the sentence trying to wound her in two places at once, her pregnancy and her sanity. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence do what her voice, if rushed, might not. An older board member, connected to the creditor banks, asked, "Mrs. Lim, do you confirm that you hold some formal power over assets related to the Lim Group?" Before Serafina could open her mouth, Eleanor leaned forward. "She cannot confirm what she doesn't understand." Julian finally spoke. "Ma, my wife understands more than any of you ever allowed her to show." Serafina glanced at him. The defense was late, but it was different. It didn't replace her. It just cleared the space. She then said, "I confirm that I represent the interests of the Grace Foundation. I didn't come to ask for a seat at this table. I came to remind you that a part of this table only exists because my mother agreed to leave it years ago." The sentence landed heavily. Some board members exchanged looks. Marcus momentarily lost his rehearsed confidence. "Grace Chen held no formal position in the Lim Group," he stated. David Ho opened a set of copies and slid them across the table. "She held no position, but she held credit, cross-guarantees, and an indirect stake in a restructuring that prevented the group's collapse 23 years ago." Eleanor slapped her hand on the table, not with scandalous force, but enough to cut through the rustle of papers. "This is irrelevant to today's meeting." Serafina faced her. "Irrelevant to those who inherited the silence, not to those who paid for it." Julian frowned. "Ma, did you know about this?" Eleanor maintained her composure, but the skin around her eyes tightened. "Your father made difficult decisions. I protected this family. That's what responsible people do." Serafina's heart raced. It was the first time the matriarch had admitted, even indirectly, that Grace Chen had not been a stranger, and that small piece of truth stirred something in Julian. He looked at his wife, as if trying to measure the amount of loneliness she had carried until that moment. The meeting turned into a battlefield without shouting. On one side, Marcus insisted that the contract with Tan Holdings had to be signed before the market closed, as the press was already speculating about governance instability. On the other, David Ho reminded them that the attempt to sideline Serafina could be interpreted as coercion and corporate bad faith. Serafina listened to it all with a calm that cost her dearly. Inside, the baby seemed quiet, and that quietness scared her more than any of the family's words. When a compliance director asked if there was a conflict of interest between Serafina and Julian's marriage and her representation of the Grace Foundation, Eleanor seized the opening. "There are many conflicts that haven't been clarified, including the haste of this pregnancy and the influence Serafina exerts over my son." The room went cold. Julian stood up, careful. His voice was low, dangerous, not with violence, but with a clear boundary. Eleanor didn't back down. "The board needs to know if we are dealing with a legitimate heir or a woman who has learned very well how to use fragility as a weapon." Serafina felt the blood rush to her face, but she didn't cry. She opened her handbag, took out a small prenatal scan report, and placed it on the table. "My pregnancy is not a corporate agenda item. My son is not a negotiating tool. If anyone in this room accepts discussing a child to weaken a woman, then the Lim Group's problem runs deeper than debt." For the first time, some board members looked away from Eleanor. Julian remained standing for a few more seconds before sitting down. Serafina noticed he was trembling with restrained anger. It wasn't enough to erase the months he had failed her, but it was a real crack in the upbringing he had received. Marcus, seeing the mood shift against them, opened another front. "Very noble, Serafina, but morality doesn't pay off loans. The deal with Tan Holdings requires trust, and as far as we know, Mr. Tan hasn't even confirmed his attendance." As if on cue, the board secretary entered discreetly and handed a note to the interim chairman. He cleared his throat and announced, "Mr. Tan Wei is on his way. He has requested that the meeting not be adjourned before his arrival." Eleanor's face tightened. Serafina remained quiet, but she remembered the previous night, the look in Mr. Tan's eyes when he saw her not as someone meeting a young wife, but as someone confronting a memory. There was a history there that even she only knew the edges of. Grace had spoken little of him. Only once, while closing a box of old documents, she had said, "Some men know how to say thank you late, but they know how." The recess called before Mr. Tan's arrival moved everyone to a private lounge next to the boardroom, where coffee, mineral, water, and untouched pastries seemed like props in a false truce. Serafina went to the window to breathe. Julian approached slowly, keeping enough distance for her to reject his presence. "I didn't know your mother had a connection to the group," he said. Serafina looked down at the street below. "You never asked about my mother. Your family decided I came from nowhere, and you let that version be comfortable." He accepted the accusation without defense. "I thought I was respecting your silence." Serafina smiled sadly. "No, Julian, you benefited from it. It was easier to love a woman without a past when that past could inconvenience your family. He lowered his eyes. I don't know how to fix this. Serafina touched her belly. Maybe you can start by not looking for a quick fix. Some things don't get mended on the same afternoon they were broken. Julian nodded, and the pain on his face brought Serafina no satisfaction. That's what scared her. She still loved him, but love could no longer be an excuse to stay wounded. On the other side of the lounge, Eleanor was speaking quietly on the phone, but Serafina caught her tone. Hold that story. I said hold it. If Grace Chen's name gets out before the signing, you will lose all access to the group. The matriarch hung up when she saw Serafina approaching. For a few seconds, the two women were separated by a narrow table with untouched coffee cups. You're still afraid of her, even today, Serafina said. Eleanor smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Of a dead woman? Don't be melodramatic. Then why does your face change every time you hear her name? Eleanor moved closer, her voice low enough not to reach the others. Your mother was a naive woman. She thought goodness entitled her to recognition. The real world doesn't work like that. Serafina felt the words cut like a thin blade. She trusted you. She wanted to be indispensable, Eleanor corrected. Learn something, Serafina. Families like ours don't survive because we're fair. We survive because we know who to sacrifice. Serafina looked at the woman and saw, behind the cruelty, a wretched fear of losing the throne she had built on ruins. And today, you're afraid that the person you sacrificed left behind a daughter. Eleanor's expression shuttered completely. You don't know half of what you think you know. Perhaps, Serafina replied. But I know enough not to sign away my own existence. Just then, Isabel appeared, phone in hand, her face anxious. Auntie, the article is out. The sound seemed to suck the air from the room. Marcus grabbed the phone and read the headline aloud before realizing he was speaking to everyone. Archive documents. Link Lim family to secret agreement with Grace Chen. Board members began receiving notifications at the same time. Julian took the phone from Marcus and read excerpts in silence, his expression changing with every line. The article didn't reveal everything, but it said enough. Grace Chen had provided essential guarantees at a moment of near bankruptcy for the group, disappearing after a private agreement that was never explained. Eleanor pointed at Serafina. You did this. Serafina shook her head. I didn't have to. David Ho, who had approached without hurry, completed the thought. When a story is buried for too long, Eleanor, any crack can feel like an earthquake. Marcus cursed under his breath and walked away to call his PR consultant. For the first time, the crisis they had tried to pin on Serafina was returning to the Lim family's doorstep. The arrival of Tan Wei was announced minutes later, but he didn't enter immediately. The wait made everything worse. Back in the boardroom, the directors returned to their seats, restless, many rereading the article on their phones, others making silent calculations about reputation, banks, and trust. Eleanor tried to restore order. This publication is speculative. It does not alter the agenda. Serafina sat down, the blue folder before her. It alters trust, and trust was precisely what you claim to be defending. The interim chairman asked David Ho if the documents from the Grace Foundation could be presented. David said yes, but Serafina raised her hand. Not yet. Julian looked at her, surprised. So did Eleanor. Serafina knew she could reveal everything right then, expose the voting power, and force everyone to listen out of fear. But that would be the easiest victory, and perhaps the emptiest. She wanted the whole truth to arrive in front of Mr. Tan, the man who had known her mother, and in front of the family that had spent years treating generosity as a weakness. First, she said, I want to hear Eleanor Lim explain to the board why Grace Chen's name was erased from the official history of the Lim Group. The silence returned, heavier than before. Eleanor stared at Serafina as if she could crush her with her remaining reputation alone. But the room was no longer the same. There were doubts in the eyes of the board members, anger on Julian's face, poorly disguised fear on Marcus's, and a dangerous calm from David Ho. Your mother accepted a settlement, Eleanor said, choosing each word like someone stepping on broken glass. No one forced her. A settlement made with a woman alone, without access to the table where you all decided her future, Serafina replied without raising her voice. Eleanor's lips tightened. She was compensated. She was paid to lose her name, Julian said, his voice fractured by a discovery that shamed him. Ma, it was her money that saved the group, wasn't it? Eleanor's silence lasted too long. That silence didn't confess everything, but it confessed enough. Serafina closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, She no longer looked like just the humiliated wife from the night before. She looked like the heir to a memory that was finally finding air. The boardroom door opened before anyone could continue. An aide announced that Mr. Tan Wei had arrived and was waiting for permission to enter. Everyone turned to Serafina without realizing it, as if the decision were hers. And perhaps it was. Eleanor saw this involuntary movement and understood that the old order was beginning to die right there, not with a scandal, but with a silent shift of the center of gravity. Serafina placed her hand on the blue folder, then on her belly. It wasn't yet time to reveal the full power of the Grace Foundation, but it was time to make it clear she would no longer be pushed into corridors, studies, or service entrances. "Let Mr. Tan enter," the interim chairman said. Augusto walked through the door with calm steps, greeted the table, and stopped in front of Serafina. His eyes went to the silver ring on the chain around her neck, now visible against her dress. His expression softened with an old sadness. "You have Grace's eyes," he said. Eleanor froze. Julian held his breath, and Serafina understood in that instant that the past had not just returned. It had come to bear witness. Tan Wei did not enter the room like a man ready to buy a company in crisis. He entered like someone carrying an old debt, and he knew that this debt had finally found its heir. Everyone expected him to greet Eleanor first, then Julian, then the senior board members, repeating the silent ritual of power that always favored the limbs. But Mr. Tan walked past them with formal respect, not stopping, and went straight to Serafina. She was seated with the blue folder before her, one hand on her belly, the other on the silver ring she no longer hid. Mr. Tan stopped in front of her, bowed his head slowly in front of the entire room, a discreet reverence, yet profound enough to shatter the atmosphere. "Mrs. Lim," he said in a clear voice, "I apologize for taking so many years to honor your mother's name. No signed contract could have caused a greater shock." Marcus turned pale. The board members exchanged glances. Julian stood motionless, and Eleanor seemed to age several years in a few seconds. Serafina took a deep breath. For the first time, someone from that sphere of power had not called her a problem, a wife, a risk, or a shame. They had called her by the name they tried to erase. The interim chairman cleared his throat, trying to recover a protocol that no longer existed. "Mr. Tan, we need to understand the relevance of this statement to today's agenda." Mr. Tan turned to him calmly. "The relevance is simple. The expansion the Lim Group wishes to undertake with Tan Holdings is contingent on the approval of the Grace Foundation, which holds voting rights tied to historical guarantees from the group's restructuring. And the legal representative of that foundation is Serafina Chen." The room filled with murmurs. Marcus stood up. "That's impossible. If that level of influence existed, we would have been informed." David Ho opened the blue folder and distributed notarized copies. "You were informed in documents that were filed away, ignored for convenience, and protected by clauses your family preferred to treat as mere details." Eleanor tried to grab one of the pages, but Julian took it before she could snatch the document from the lawyer's hands. "No," he said, looking at his mother. "This time, I'm going to read it before defending any version of the story." Serafina heard the words without moving, but something inside her recognized the difference. Julian wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was starting to pay the price of the truth. The copies circulated around the table with the dry sound of paper on wood. There were registry records, old minutes, letters of guarantee, updated powers of attorney, and the formal recognition of voting rights transferred to Serafina upon the completion of Grace Chen's estate. The compliance director read one of the clauses under her breath, then looked up, surprised. "This clause invalidates any waiver made under familial pressure, reputational threat, or a state of physical vulnerability." David Ho nodded. "It was drafted by Grace Chen when she realized they might one day try to use marriage, pregnancy, or silence against her daughter." Eleanor lost her patience. "This is emotional manipulation disguised as a legal document." "No," Serafina replied before her lawyer could. "Manipulation is calling a pregnant woman unstable to force her to sign away her own exclusion. A document is what my mother left behind when she understood that people like you confuse power with truth." A board member from one of the banks looked up. "Eleanor, the addendum presented yesterday and today directly contravenes this clause." Her silence lasted too long. Marcus tried to answer, but Mr. Tan cut him off. "Don't ask the son. Ask the one who ordered it to be drafted." Eleanor looked at Mr. Tan as if seeing an old ally transform into a judge. "You have no right to come into my company and humiliate my family." "Your family humiliated Serafina long before I walked through this door," Mr. Tan replied calmly. She deceived all of us, Eleanor retorted. She married into this family hiding the fact she was carrying a weapon against the group. Serafina felt the accusation hit the point she feared most. Perhaps everyone there, maybe even Julian, believed she had orchestrated revenge from the start. She looked at her husband and, for an instant, saw the question in his eyes. She spoke to the whole room, but mainly to him. I hid it because I promised my mother I wouldn't use the foundation out of anger. I married Julian because I loved him, not because I needed to get into this family. If I wanted to destroy the limbs, I would have done it before the pregnancy, before the articles, before you called me a shame in my own home. Julian lowered his head. When he looked up again, there was real shame in his eyes, not the shame his family had tried to pin on her, but his own. I should have believed in you before I needed documents, he said. Yes, Serafina replied without softening. You should have. Marcus, realizing the room was slipping away for good, decided to attack as he always had, through fear. Fine, she has documents. So what? Are we going to hand the future of hundreds of employees to a resentful woman with a 20-year-old grudge? Serafina turned to him. Hundreds of employees. Interesting to hear you mention them now, after you've used the company as a shield to protect your family's pride. He pointed at the folder. You don't know how to run a group this size. I didn't come here today to run the group, she said. I came to stop it from being saved at the cost of another lie. David Ho produced another document, this one smaller, with digital revision marks printed on it. And there is another point. The addendum they tried to force upon Mrs. Lim was prepared after the first press briefing was released, which demonstrates a sequence of reputational pressure. The compliance director examined the paper. Who requested the draft? The in-house lawyer, Peixoto, sitting in the corner, turned pale. Eleanor fixed her eyes on him, but it was too late. He took a deep breath. The order came from Mrs. Eleanor Lim, with express instructions to mention a leave of absence due to emotional instability, if necessary. The sentence didn't need to be shouted. It landed like a verdict. Julian stood up slowly. Ma, you tried to use Serafina's condition and our child to remove her from the negotiation. Eleanor still tried to maintain her authority. I was trying to save you. From what? His voice broke, but he didn't back down. From my wife? From my son? Or from the truth about what you did to Grace Chen? Eleanor slammed her hand on the table. I did what had to be done. Your father was surrounded by debt, by banks, by men waiting for us to fall. Grace wanted recognition, a place at the table, her name next to ours. It would have destroyed the family's image. Mr. Tan, silent until then, approached the table. Grace didn't want to take anyone's place. She wanted her help not to be treated as a shame. Serafina felt her eyes burn, but remained firm. Eleanor realized too late that she had said too much. The compliance director asked, "So you confirm there was an agreement to omit her participation?" Eleanor's face hardened. "I confirm that I protected the Lim name." Serafina closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, there was sadness, not triumph. "That's what you called my child yesterday. A shame. The same name you gave my mother when she saved you." The room was suspended between past and present. Mr. Tan then recounted what he had never said publicly. Years ago, when the Lim construction empire was sinking in debt and no one would touch a family on the verge of collapse, Grace Chen had offered guarantees through a discreet trust structure, not to buy power, but to prevent a bankruptcy that would have dragged down suppliers, workers, and small investors. In return, she had only asked that her contribution be acknowledged in internal documents and that her daughter, if she ever needed it, would have protection from the very men who made her sign agreements from outside the room. "I saw Grace leave a meeting through a side door," Mr. Tan said, "and I saw Eleanor enter through the main one to receive congratulations that didn't belong only to the Lims." "You also stayed silent," Eleanor whispered. Mr. Tan nodded without flinching. "I did, out of cowardice, out of convenience, and because men like me call delay prudence when we want to avoid blame. I will not do that again today. That is why I bowed. Not before money, but before a debt." The press conference was waiting 2 floors below, and the board members' phones were vibrating non-stop. The market was already reacting to the article. Shareholders were demanding explanations, banks required assurances, and Tan Holdings had the power to suspend the entire deal. Marcus whispered to his mother that they could still claim forgery, instability, family conflict. Serafina heard him and stood up. "I will not do what you expect. I will not destroy the Lim Group today. Not because it deserves mercy, but because there are people who work here who never participated in the cowardly choices made in this room. The Grace Foundation will approve the continuation of negotiations with Tan Holdings under 3 conditions. Eleanor laughed without humor. You think you're in a position to impose conditions? She is, Mr. Tan answered for her. Serafina continued. First, the immediate suspension of Eleanor Lim and Marcus Lim from all governance-related decisions, while an independent audit reviews the historical documents and the recent attempt at coercion against me. Second, a public retraction of the insinuations made against my honor and my pregnancy. Third, Julian will declare before this board whether he wants to lead a company that protects the truth or continue to be the obedient son of a lie. Julian received the third condition as if Serafina had opened the ground beneath him. It wasn't a humiliation. It was a choice, and perhaps for that reason, it hurt more. Julian, think of your name, Eleanor urged. He looked at his mother, then at Serafina. He saw the woman he loved, pregnant, pale with exhaustion, but still standing after a night and a morning of attacks. He also saw all the times he had chosen the comfort of later. My name is worthless if I use it to hide what we did to her, he said. Eleanor recoiled, as if the words had physically struck her, though no one had touched her. Julian turned to the board. I support the conditions of the Grace Foundation, and before the press conference, I will state that Serafina Chen was the victim of an attempt to sideline her, conducted by my own family. Marcus exploded with indignation, accusing his brother of betraying their blood for a woman, but no one joined him. Power always seems eternal, until the first silence of the accomplices. The emergency vote was called. Board members who hours before had looked at Serafina as an intruder now avoided contradicting the documents, the reputation of Mr. Tan, and the moral weight of the revelation. The temporary suspension of Eleanor and Marcus was approved by a majority. The conditional continuation of the deal with Tan Holdings passed as well. When the results appeared on the screen, Eleanor remained motionless at the head of the table, but she no longer commanded it. Serafina didn't smile. The victory felt less sweet than she had imagined as a young woman who thought justice healed everything. Justice, she was now discovering, only removed the knife from the wound. The scar would still come later. Julian approached her, not trying to touch her. You could have ended everything. Serafina looked at him, and I almost did. Do you know why I didn't? He didn't answer. Because my mother didn't save this company so I could use it as a weapon against innocent people. And because I don't want my son to inherit revenge as his family name. Julian couldn't respond. There were no pretty words to match the dignity of that choice. Before they went down to the press conference, Serafina stood alone for a few moments in the glass corridor. Singapore glittered under a harsh afternoon light, indifferent to the dramas of families who thought themselves bigger than the city. Mr. Tan approached and stood beside her. Grace would have been proud. Serafina clasped the ring between her fingers. She would have been sad that this was necessary. That too, he admitted. Julian appeared in the distance, waiting without intruding. Serafina noticed. Mr. Tan did too. He will need to prove more than regret, the tycoon said. I know, Serafina replied. When Julian finally approached, his voice was low. At the press conference, I'm going to tell the truth. But first, I need to tell you. I failed as a husband when I turned my silence into an excuse. I'm not going to ask for that to disappear. Serafina faced him, too tired to soften her words, too whole to lie. Then start by not asking for anything. He nodded. For the first time, Julian accepted that the only way forward might mean walking behind her while she reclaimed her own name. Downstairs, camera flashes exploded when the elevator doors opened. Eleanor did not appear. Marcus tried, but was blocked by the new interim chairman. Serafina walked between Julian, David Ho, and Mr. Tan, not in the center out of vanity, but because history had finally placed her where they had always tried to prevent her from being. In front of the journalists, Julian spoke first. The Lim Group acknowledges that Serafina Chen was unduly exposed by internal disputes and that any insinuation about her honor or her pregnancy is false, cruel, and unacceptable. A murmur swept the room. Then, Mr. Tan spoke about the conditional continuation of the deal and the importance of the Grace Foundation. Finally, Serafina approached the microphone. She didn't reveal everything, didn't turn her pain into a spectacle. She said only, "My mother believed that a company is only worth what it is willing to protect when no one is watching. Today, I chose to protect the truth without destroying those who depend on it." From the back of the room, Julian watched her, like someone finally understanding that the woman they called a shame was, in fact, the moral measure of them all. The press conference ended before the city finished passing judgment. Outside the MBFC tower, Cameras were still hunting for a crueler, quote, a more useful tear, a gesture that could become a headline before dinner. Serafina left through a side door, not to hide, but because her body was finally demanding payment for so many hours on her feet. David Ho walked by her side, Mr. Tan slightly behind, and Julian kept his distance, as he had promised without words in the corridor. In the car, as Raffles Place drew near under the late afternoon light, Serafina rested her head against the seat and closed her eyes. There was no complete relief. The public retraction had cleared some of the mud. The suspension of Eleanor and Marcus had shifted the balance of power. The deal with Tan Holdings was still alive, but inside her, a more intimate question remained, one that no document could answer. After reclaiming her own name, would it be possible to continue carrying the Lim name without tasting humiliation? The baby stirred, a gentle flutter. Serafina placed a hand on her belly. "And now," she whispered, as if speaking to the child and her mother at the same time, "now, we breathe." Julian didn't go back to their penthouse that night. He went to the group's headquarters, gathered the directors still on the executive floor, and did what he should have done before Serafina was forced to prove her dignity with papers. He signed off on the opening of an independent audit into the historical documents, suspended all communications contracts linked to Marcus, and sent a formal declaration to the board assuming responsibility for allowing his family to interfere in his wife's personal life. With each signature, he felt less power and more shame. Not the shame Eleanor had thrown at Serafina, but a clean, necessary shame, the kind that peels the false skin off a man. When an aide asked if he wanted to soften the press release to protect his image, Julian replied, "My image has been protected by other people's lies for too long." Later, alone in the glass-walled office, he saw the city reflected on the empty desk and understood that losing control was perhaps the first honest thing he had done in years. Eleanor Lim received the board's decision at the Nassim Road bungalow, seated at the head of the dining table, where she still expected everyone to ask her permission to breathe. But no one asked. The family's lawyer read out the temporary suspension, the restrictions on her access to strategic documents, and the recommendation that she not speak on behalf of the Lim Group until the audit was complete. Isabel cried quietly, not out of love, but out of fear of falling with her. Marcus exploded, shouting that Julian had betrayed their blood, that Serafina had bewitched his brother, that Mr. Tan was a cowardly old man trying to clean up his own guilt. Eleanor didn't scream. That would have been less frightening. She remained motionless, staring at the glass of water before her, as if its transparency offended her. "I gave my life to this family," she finally said. The lawyer, embarrassed, didn't reply. The sentence might have been true. The problem was that Eleanor had also given the lives of others, without asking for permission. And that night, for the first time, the grand house didn't feel like a palace. It felt like a home too large for a woman who had lost her subjects. Serafina spent 2 days in the old HDB flat that had belonged to her mother in Tiong Bahru. It wasn't luxurious like Julian's penthouse, nor imposing like the Lim mansion. But here, the objects held memories without cruelty. There was a shelf with Grace's books, a faded green armchair, photographs stored in boxes, and a narrow window through which Singapore entered without apology. Julian called a few times. Serafina didn't answer on the first day. On the second, she sent a single message, "I need silence that isn't a punishment." He replied, "I will respect that." That small answer didn't heal anything, but it didn't invade either. And that, in itself, was different. David Ho visited Serafina at dusk, bringing final documents and a sealed letter Grace had left behind. "She asked that you read this when the Grace Foundation was no longer a secret," he explained. Serafina held the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside, her mother's handwriting was slightly shaky, but every word felt alive. "My daughter, do not confuse justice with revenge. Revenge still binds us to those who hurt us. Justice opens the door." Serafina wept then, not like she had cried hidden in the mansion's bathroom, nor as she had almost cried in the boardroom. She wept with her whole body, sitting on the floor of the flat, clutching the letter to her chest while the baby moved, as if participating in that delayed grief. Grace wrote that she had helped the Lim Group because she believed companies carried families, workers, dreams too small to appear in headlines. She also wrote that Eleanor had pressured her to accept a silent agreement, convincing her that public recognition would destroy negotiations and expose Serafina, still a child, to a fight she could not choose. "I agreed to leave the room," Grace wrote, "but I left the door open for you, in case one day they tried to lock you on the other side." Serafina kissed the silver ring and understood that her mother had not left her a weapon. She had left her a way out. The difference was everything. On the third day, Julian appeared in the corridor of her building without warning, but he didn't ring the bell. Serafina saw him through the peephole, holding a thin folder and no flowers. For some reason, that made her open the door. He looked like he had slept little, with a shadow of a beard and less certain eyes. "I didn't come to ask to come back," he said before she could ask. "I came to give you this." Serafina took the folder. Inside was the statement filed with the board, the retraction sent to the newspapers, and a copy of the request for Marcus's permanent removal from any executive role during the audit. There was also a handwritten letter. "You don't have to read it now," he said. Serafina leafed through the documents in silence. "And your mother?" Julian took a deep breath. "She has lost her access to governance. She will have to answer to the audit. And I told her that if she ever attacks you or our son again, she will have no place in my life." Serafina raised her eyes. "You said that when she could still hear you?" He nodded. "Yes, without waiting for you to be in the room to see me do it." That sentence touched a place Serafina didn't want to open so soon. She let him in but didn't offer coffee. Julian didn't complain. He stood in the small living room, looking at Grace's books, as if he were in a house where he needed to apologize even to the walls. "I read about your mother," he said. "Not everything, just what the documents allow. The rest, if you ever want to tell me, I'll listen." Serafina crossed her arms. "You realize listening would have been simpler before." He closed his eyes. "I realize that. And you realize I can't rebuild a marriage just because you finally realize." "I realize that too." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't violent. Julian took his wedding ring from his pocket and placed it on the table, not as a threat, but as a relinquishment. "I used our marriage as a place where you were supposed to fit within the limits of my family. I won't do that anymore. If you ever choose to wear this ring again, I want it to be because it fits you, not because I put it there." Serafina looked at the circle of gold on the old wood. The urge to cry returned, but she breathed until it passed. The audit took weeks, and each week stripped away another layer of the Lim family's official story. The business press, which had once treated Serafina as an unstable wife, began calling her the heir to the Grace Foundation, a title she endured with discomfort. Mr. Tan kept his word, proceeding with the negotiation only after the governance was overhauled and a clause protecting workers and small suppliers was included. Marcus lost his executive position. Without the luster of his family name acting as an immediate shield, he discovered that few allies remain when power stops paying the bills. Eleanor, removed from the company, still tried to rally relatives, influence old board members, and plant stories in society columns, but each gesture only reinforced the report that placed her at the center of the coercion against Serafina and the erasure of Grace. Her punishment was not a spectacular imprisonment or a theatrical ruin. It was worse for someone like her. She ceased to be necessary. The family continued to meet, the company continued to run, the journalists continued to call, but it was no longer her voice that decided who entered through the main door. Serafina returned to the MBFC tower only once, a month later, to sign the final restructuring documents. This time, she entered without David Ho by her side, though he waited for her in the boardroom. Employees greeted her with restrained respect, some with visible shame. She didn't need everyone's regret. She just needed no one to pretend her presence was a favor. In the boardroom, Julian presented the new governance model, formally acknowledging the historical contribution of Grace Chen and creating an internal policy against familial coercion in corporate decisions. It was technical, almost cold, but Serafina understood the symbolic weight. Her mother's name was finally in the minutes. When it was her turn to sign, Serafina held the pen for an extra second. She remembered the study in the mansion, the burgundy folder, the sound of Eleanor's voice calling her son an inconvenience. Then she signed with a firm hand, not to belong to the Lims, but to end the cycle in which the Lims decided who could be remembered. Leaving the meeting, she found Julian in the corridor. He didn't try to turn the moment into a reconciliation. He just walked beside her to the window. "Today, I heard your name spoken without fear in that room," he said. Serafina looked out at the city. "Me too. And it made me understand how much I stole when I stayed silent." She turned her face to him. "You didn't steal it alone, but you had the chance to give it back sooner." "I know," Julian accepted. "And now?" Serafina placed a hand on her belly, now more visible under her light dress. "I'm going to stay at my mother's flat for now. After the baby is born, we'll decide on co-parenting. Our son will not be used to mend what is still broken." The pain cut across Julian's face, but he didn't try to negotiate. "I will be present in whatever way you allow, and I will keep doing what needs to be done. even when you aren't watching. Serafina studied his face, looking for the old man who asked for patience without changing. She didn't find him completely, nor did she yet find a new husband. She found someone in the middle of a crossing. Perhaps that was the only honest beginning possible. Months later, on a clear morning, Serafina walked through the botanic gardens with her baby in her arms, a cool breeze making the frangipani trees tremble. The boy was named Ethan Chen Lim, not to force families together, but to carry both truths without erasing either one. Raphael walked beside her, pushing the empty pram, because Ethan preferred his mother's arms. They still didn't live together, still didn't pretend that love was enough, but Julian was there for the appointments, the difficult nights, the meetings where Serafina's signature was treated with respect, and for the small choices no one applauded. One day, Eleanor asked to see her grandson. Serafina agreed, but only in a neutral place, with clear boundaries. The matriarch appeared without her pearls, without her entourage, and without her orders. Upon seeing Ethan, she wept in silence. Serafina didn't forgive her that day. She simply allowed her to look at the child without touching the past as if she owned it. That afternoon, returning to Grace's flat, Julian stopped at the door before leaving. "Serafina," he called. She turned, with a sleeping Ethan in her arms. He looked at the wedding ring she still kept on a chain, not on her finger. "I still love you." Serafina didn't look away. And now? The answer could have been an ending, but it didn't sound like one. It sounded like a door left ajar, without hurry, without cheap promises. Julian smiled with sadness and gratitude. "Then I keep learning." Serafina went inside, laid Ethan in his cot, and stood for a few moments looking at the city from the narrow window. Grace's silver ring glittered on the table, next to the wedding band that was still waiting for a decision. Serafina touched them both, but chose neither that night. For the first time, this wasn't fear, it was freedom. The woman they called a shame had become the guardian of her own name, and any love that wanted to stay would have to learn to bow before that.